Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be restoring this beautiful motor which was made by General Electric. This motor is a type SCR, and that stands for Squirrel Cage Repulsion. And what's unique about this motor compared to other motors that I featured on the channel is that this is a true repulsion-induction motor. It does not have any type of a shorting necklace like the Century, for example, which is a repulsion start induction run. On this motor, the rotor has two sets of windings, one of which they refer to as a squirrel cage, and both sets of windings are in play all the time. So it's a less complicated design. There's less things to go wrong with it since you don't have the shorting necklace and you don't have the flyweight mechanism or any of that stuff coming into play. It's a simpler design. It's very effective. This motor here weighs about 110 pounds. I don't know exactly how many horsepower it is because there's no data plate on it, but just by looking at it I'm guessing it's probably a 1 to 1.5 horsepower. This motor was made in the early to mid 1930s, probably around 1935. Tracked down a copy of the 1935 GE catalog, and this motor was in there, and at that time this motor would cost about $57, and in today's money that translates to about $1,150. Considering that the country was just starting to come out of the Great Depression in 1935, that was a lot of money to spend on a motor. So it'll be interesting when we take this motor apart to see how the rotor is built compared to the traditional repulsion start induction run motors that we've looked at previously. So hopefully you're going to enjoy following along with the restoration of this beautiful motor. The first thing I need to do is remove this sheave off the shaft here, and unfortunately somebody was banging on the end of this shaft with a hammer, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of filing on here just to even attempt to get this pulley off of here, because sandpaper is not going to get that done. So we'll file that, and first step we'll try to take the pulley off. Okay, so you can see here where the shaft was marred up from the set screws, and that's what was causing that resistance for that pulley to come off of there. So just stayed on it, used a bunch of pressure, and used a little bit of heat on it, and a couple curse words, and we were able to get it off of there. And then I used a cold chisel to remove the key from the keyway. So now the next step is going to be to go ahead and remove these end bills. Alright, so we got the motor broken down into its main components, and starting at the stator first, As you can see here, the stator is just filled up with some kind of a gravel. I don't know what that material is, but I do know that it would be an awful idea to continue running the motor with that gravel in there. That would just destroy those windings. So we're going to need to do a thorough job of getting that stator cleaned out and remove all that foreign material out of here. Moving over here to the rotor, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, you'll notice there's no shorting necklace, there's no flyweights on this thing. It's just one unit. So outside here you have your repulsion windings, and then on the inside, made out of cast aluminum, is your squirrel cage windings, and those just stay in action all the time. This particular model does have a fan on it. This fan has a lot of corrosion on it, so we're going to have to get that tightened up. Moving over here to the commutator. The commutator appears to be in pretty good condition, so that's a good sign as far as the rotor is concerned. Now moving over here to this end bell. This is the end bell that has the brush housing assembly on it, and there's some slots in here for you to rotate the brush assembly. And these brushes they look a little bit worn. I have to look at them a little bit closer, but those are some pretty big brushes. I don't know if I have any that big in my collection. I have to take a look. So this is going to need a thorough cleaning also, because as you can see here, it's filled up with that same gravel material that's in the stator. This is the other one. Same thing, filled up with grime and foreign material. Down here I have the thrust washers. I always make a notation of where those washers were, how many were on each side, because those are real important to control the axial play of the rotor when you put it back together. Over here we have our pulley, we got our bolts. So now we're going to just proceed one piece at a time and start getting each piece cleaned up. So here you can see the loose grime that I swept out of the front end bell. That's only the front end bell. That thing was loaded up. So here you can see the large amount of oil wicking material that was stuffed into each end bell. The good news is that the wicking is completely saturated with oil, and those bearings appear to be in really good condition, so I'll probably be able to reuse those, which is always a good thing. This wicking material, however, it's starting to break down, so that I'm going to have to replace, and we're going to replace that with some type of a wool yarn when the time comes. So the next thing I want to do is remove the brush assembly from that end bell. Okay, so the brush assembly is held in place with these two screws right here. But before I remove it, I'm going to take the Dremel. I want to make a little witness mark on this brush housing in relationship to the body, just so I kind of have a reference of where these were positioned before I start taking it apart. Okay, so I want to begin working on cleaning up the stator, and as I mentioned previously, the stator was just loaded up with a type of a gravel inside of there, and it's all over the windings. So before bringing the stator up here, I took a shop vac and I just kind of vacuumed out the loose gravel. What I'm trying to avoid is having that gravel rub around in between those windings there. That'll just destroy that insulation on those wires. So if you look inside here, you can see that those windings still have a lot of gravel left inside there. So I'm very carefully going to try to spend some time loosening that and then vacuuming it up. The other thing that I see happening here is this twine, which is used just to kind of secure these windings in place, is it's all dry rotted. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this white twine, and we will re-secure that with something else. So that's going to be the next step. Okay, so I spent about at least 2 hours, maybe longer, cleaning up these windings, and as you can see here, they look a hell of a lot better than the one I started. So in cleaning up the windings, I actually hosed this off with a little bit of warm water after I had all the big particles out of there, just to make sure that all that gravel and everything was flushed out of there. So these windings have a little bit of moisture in them, and up until this time, I hadn't checked the stator with the megger yet, because it's kind of pointless to check it with the megger when the windings are completely filled up with grease and contaminants, sawdust. Any of that stuff could affect the readings. So I didn't even want to check it until I kind of had them cleaned up a little bit so we get a more accurate reading. So now I have the megger hooked up over here, and I took the first reading. Now these windings are still a little damp from me cleaning them, so it's at about 400K right now, so that's a little bit low. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a heating pad in here and cover this whole thing up with a towel. And these windings are going to need to dry out, stay warm and dry for, maybe even 24 hours, maybe longer, whatever it takes for the mega reading to go up a little bit, which it will go up as these dry out. So I'm going to set that up right now and just set this off to the side and just let the mega reading come up like it's supposed to be. Okay, so this is the setup that I'm using drying out these windings. It's simple and it works good. I just got a nice big heating pad in there, got that turned up on high, and I got a towel over the whole thing. I'll just keep that closed up like that. That'll stay nice and toasty in there. And I have the megger hooked up over here, and periodically I'll check the mega readings, and as long as the mega reading is increasing and the windings continue to dry out and the mega reading gets stronger, I'll leave it be, and I'll leave it in this position until the mega readings stop getting any better. Once they max out, then we'll take the heating pad out of there. Okay, since we got the windings warm and dry, we're going to go ahead and immediately coat them up with this Gliptol red insulating varnish, and to give them a nice thick coat with this product, and it holds up very well. Alright, so on the rotor, I brushed off all the loose rust with a wire brush on the fins of the fan there, and I'm using this rust neutralizer to convert that to a black oxide, and then I'll just coat it with either a clear coat or a little black paint, something like that. On the windings for the rotor, I used the clear spray varnish on there. Those actually do have the varnish on there. The reason why I didn't use the brush on is because I realized that I couldn't get in there very good because of this fan being in the way, and so I wanted to make sure everything was coated, so I just used the spray on that. And the next thing I'm going to be doing is cleaning up the commutator and make sure that all those commutator segments are undercut. Alright, so I didn't want to bore you with the painting. This is just a basic black paint job. I intend to use this motor, so nothing fancy here. Alright, looking at this brush assembly here, now that I got it cleaned up, I can see that there are actually a couple arrows here, and the purpose of those arrows is to use that as a reference in case you want to move the brush holder over. So I had already put that little witness mark there, but that's not going to hurt anything. I mentioned earlier that I don't have the correct size carbon brush in my collection, So I went over to eBay and I found a seller who was selling lots of carbon brushes, and they were only $5 for a batch of 4 of them. So I found these here, which are just a hair wider than what I need, but I'll file them down, and for $5 you really can't go wrong for 4 brushes. So I actually bought an extra set, so I'll have an extra set of 4 brushes for this motor on backup. So anyways, I'll get these filed down and put them in the brush holder assembly. Okay, so we got the new brushes cut to the correct size. I just did that with a hacksaw and then just used a file just to smooth them out a little bit after the cut. And I made the new brushes about a 1/64 of an inch or so narrower than the old brushes. I noticed that the old brushes, they fit into the housing, but it was kind of a tight fit, and you don't want those brushes to bind up for any reason in there. So by making them just a little bit narrower, they should be able to slide around in that brush housing a little bit easier. So that's going to work out real nice. Tubing. I got these wired in parallel because I'll be running this motor on 110. So I'm going to put a little heat shrink tubing right where the wire comes out of the housing there, just for a little abrasion resistance. Went ahead and I put a little bit of oil on the shaft. I find it's easier to reassemble these motors if you carefully place the rotor inside the stator like this, and you got to be careful not to bang up those windings that you just did a lot of work on. So I carefully placed that in there, and now I'll put the Endbill on. The reason why to me it's easier is because having this shaft here, that'll hold up the Endbill and help you locate those holes a little bit easier. This rotor is really heavy, so if you were to put the Endbill on first and then try to finagle that rotor into position, you have a lot greater chance that you're going to damage those windings, because it's much harder to control that rotor from one side, and that thing's really heavy. I don't have the carbon brushes in here yet. We'll use these little access panels and put them in there after we have the Endbill on. Okay, so we got the housing pretty much back together, and this rotor really turns in here nice. those bearings are really almost in brand new condition, so that worked out good that we didn't have to replace those. Saved us a little bit of work. One thing I did notice is there is a little bit of axial play in the rotor. Now, a small amount of play is necessary. The rotor will find its electronic center once it's running. So what I'm going to do with that is take a wait and see approach. Go ahead, gonna get the rest of the motor back together. We'll get the motor fired up, and we're going to see how it runs. If I notice that that thing is oscillating at all or bouncing around in there, I'll go ahead and put another thrust washer in there. But I don't want that plate. It needs to have a little bit of room, so we'll just do that if it's necessary after we test it out. I'm at the point now where I need to reinstall the wool yarn wick oilers. If you remember, we made some new ones. So what I've done is I've already saturated those with a little bit of oil, just so I know they're all nice and fully soaked up before I put them in there. So I got you kind of zoomed in on the Endbill here, and as you can see, there's a cutout in the bearing and the shaft is exposed. So when we replace those oilers, what we need to do is straddle them directly over that exposed shaft area so that they'll pick up oil from the bottom of the reservoir and deposit it on top of that shaft. So we got our yarn stuffed in there, and when we put the cap on here, the cap has this flat spring, and that'll hold that wicking material in place. Okay, so as we saw with our little test there, the motor's drawn about 14.5 amps. That's with no load on it. So for our purposes, we're going to label that as a 1 horsepower. It's a strong 1 horsepower, but we'll label it as a 1 horsepower. So one thing I'll need to do is I'm going to need to make a new data plate for it because the old one is completely missing. So we'll make new data plate for it. The other thing I need to do is once I get the cord permanently hooked up, which we don't have yet, I need to run in these brushes, and we're going to use a commutator stone to let those brushes seat. Because the brushes are brand new, the angle of the brush is not the same angle as the commutator because they're squared off at the end. So that's going to have to run in and let those get properly seated. So those are a couple things we're going to be doing next. So we have the cord connected, and that came out real nice. Got it grounded to the body inside the peckerhead there, and that should hold up real well over time. What I'm working on now is I need to make a new data plate for the motor since the original one was missing. I did some searching online, and I found the information that I need to put on there, at least a close approximation. I have a bunch of these blank data plates here, and for this project I'll use the brass one, and I got a letter punch set, so we're just going to go ahead and punch in the information that we need. Okay, and here is the finished data plate. Came out looking pretty good. Alright, so as you can see there, looking from the back end of the motor is running counterclockwise. Now I'm going to go ahead and loosen up these 2 screws here. And using the arrows that are on the brush housing assembly, I put a little red dot there to use as a reference. We'll slide these over until it's lined up with the other arrow there. And then we'll resecure these screws. I'll give the motor a little test. You're running in the other direction. That's how you change the direction on a General Electric SCR repulsion induction motor. Okay, so now the motor is finished, and I couldn't be happier with the way that it came out. I mean, this thing really has that quiet, smooth power like a high-end sports car with a V8 engine. I mean, it's really awesome. I mean, for a 1 horsepower motor, this thing is everything you would want a 1 horsepower motor to be, and then some. It looks good and it runs good. This was a relatively easy project. I probably have less than 10 hours in on it. It was almost like a refurbishment more so than a full-on restoration. The most difficult part of the project was definitely preserving those windings and getting those straightened out. Once we accomplished that, the rest of it was pretty straightforward. Bearings were already in good shape, so it was a pretty straightforward project. It was a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to actually using this motor. I have a small vintage table saw, and this would be ideal for that. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed following along on this project. These General Electric SCR motors are really unique. They're simple, they're elegant, and they're really awesome motors. So hope you enjoyed the video, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. Thank you very much for watching.